Hi, everyone. I'm here with Yasmina. So welcome, Yasmina. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so I know that you have kind of a crazy story, personal story, and your experience with histamine and that kind of led you to all of the knowledge and to doing what you're doing now. So I would love if you could just tell us all a little bit about how you came to do what you now do.
So I first noticed something was terribly wrong when I was working as a journalist in Iraq, and it's a little difficult when you're kind of passing out and suffering from weird dehydration and running to the bathroom every couple of minutes, and you're on a military embed and you're putting everybody's life at stake because you have to run to the toilet every few minutes. So I kind of had to retire from that life as a journalist and figure out what was going on with me. And it was really difficult because at the time, nobody had heard of histamine, or barely any people had heard of it. There was no information on the internet. And, I had to self-diagnose and kind of work out what was going on. And that's why I started writing about it, because nobody else was.
Very interesting. So what is histamine and what is histamine intolerance?
So histamine is an inflammatory agent that is found in the body in a white blood cell called a mast cell. Now, mast cells are an integral part of the immune system, and when they break open to release histamine in the body. And so, for example, when we need healing, when we're exposed to a virus, or sometimes when we're triggered by allergies or, things like that, the mast cells break open in a process called degranulation. And histamine is one of the inflammatory mediators that's released to get to the area where there's a problem and to allow the other inflammatory agents to penetrate. So as a consequence, histamine causes a lot of inflammation because that's really its job. And when you have too much of it, it's a problem. But histamine is also found in foods. And some people lack an enzyme or two enzymes, the DAO and HNMT enzymes, to degrade the histamine. And when you lack those enzymes, the histamine just keeps building up and building up until you spill over into these crazy reactions that nobody can really diagnose. There's maybe 20, I'm guesstimating here, there's very few doctors in the world who can diagnose either histamine intolerance, which is basically a lack of these enzymes or one of the enzymes and too much histamine, or mast cell activation, which is considered where mast cells are degranulating kind of at will for no good reason and just splurging inflammation into the body.
Mm-hmm. So how is this diagnosed? I know you just said that very few people in the world are, it sounds like, really looking for this or trying to diagnose it or can diagnose it. How does one actually diagnose this, and what are the key things there?
So there's a couple of different ways. One is to go to a naturopath who can run a blood histamine test, and also a test for diamine oxidase, the DAO enzyme that degrades histamine. Unfortunately, histamine and DAO both fluctuate wildly, from hour to hour, really, because histamine is involved in not every, but it's involved in about 20 different major body processes. And so, it's a neurotransmitter. It gets the digestive process going. It regulates our circadian rhythm. It can give us insomnia. It's implicated in narcolepsy. So it's really difficult to track, with that fluctuation. So that's one way of trying to get a handle on things. The kind of golden standard because of this is the fact is an elimination diet. It's considered the golden standard. So you do it for 4 weeks, you eliminate all the high histamine foods, and if you get better, there's your answer.
Mm-hmm.
There are drawbacks to this as well, because obviously, when you lower inflammation generally, you can have a false positive. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the histamine. It could be just inflammation generally. So it can get a bit confusing. In terms of mast cells, you can go to an immunologist or an allergist, and you can get tested for different inflammatory mediators that are released from mast cells. So, there's a couple of different approaches depending on whether or not you're lucky enough to find somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But plenty of information on my website that there's all the studies, people can download them and take them to a doctor and hopefully be listened to.
Yeah, I hope so.
We had a good laugh there.
Yeah, serious. So what are the symptoms of histamine intolerance, and what should kind of be, cues that somebody's alarm bells are going off in their head as to starting to suspect that histamine is a problem for them?
It's basically allergy-like symptoms. But it's such a mixed bag. Things like bloating or IBS, dizziness, brain fog, food intolerance-like symptoms, inability to remember things. Well, I guess that falls under brain fog, and but more generally, it can be linked to the bladder. It can be linked to our emotional state, because as a neurotransmitter, it interacts with GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So, there's that interplay. There are really about 55 or 60, I think it was, symptoms that we know of that are very commonly related to mast cell and histamine issues. And that's why doctors get confused. But those are the biggies. Anything that looks like a rash, any flushing, hives, urticaria, things like that.
Gotcha. So a lot of these symptoms are general and can be mixed up with a lot of other things. So how does one sort out, whether their issues are coming from histamine or from potentially other causes?
I mean, I guess that's why the elimination diet is the golden standard, but that would only narrow it down to the fact that it's an inflammatory issue. But that also gets confusing, because if you're sensitive to them, salicylic acid found in plants, oxalic acid, fructose, and many other compounds found in foods can trigger inflammation if the body is already in a state of dysregulation. Mm-hmm. So, it's difficult. But I would say that's where the practitioner steps in. You can at least narrow it down to an inflammatory issue, and then you can kind of play around with different food lists and see if you do better with one or the other. But in my view, if you narrow it down to an inflammatory issue, what you really want to do is just support the body overall inflammation-wise. That's why my approach to histamine issues differs from everybody else's. Everybody else's is eliminate and then try and, eventually, add things back to the diet. But what actually ends up happening is that people eliminate, and then they eliminate, and they eliminate, and they eliminate, and they eliminate. And then when they try to bring foods back to the diet, it's unsuccessful because they have eliminated for too long, and the body is, lacking nutrients. The immune system is just thinking, well, it's in a panic when you reintroduce something. Sometimes it's been gone too long, especially if the immune system is on high alert generally, So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that distinction about your approach, because you talk about how other people are really focused on giving you these long lists of foods to eliminate and avoid, and you have your list of foods to include and foods you should actively be seeking out and eating more of. So can you just talk a bit about what those foods are and why they're important?
Absolutely. So originally when I was diagnosed, I was told, either take these 8 medications or, that's pretty much all we can do for you. But by that point, I had already realized that I could kind of manage my symptoms through diet alone. But there was this great natural supplement called Neuroprotect that was developed by a mast cell researcher, Dr. Theo Harides at Tufts. And I was told that it was the solution to all my problems. A lot of people with histamine and mast cell issues were taking it. And I cried when I realized I couldn't tolerate it. Oh. And then I kind of looked at it. I looked at the label and I thought, well, where else can I find all of this? So while it's difficult to work your way up to a therapeutic dose using these foods, they do act synergistically. So, combining the quercetin found in, apples, broccoli, in herbs like cilantro, basil, which themselves have antihistamine and anti-inflammatory properties independently of the bioflavonoids quercetin and luteolin, which have been shown to act as antihistamines. They have other compounds that are doing great things like antioxidants. Antioxidants have been found to mediate the damage done to the body by histamine. So, we have a bunch of different stuff going on there. And when you combine all of these amazing foods together, you're looking for brightly colored vegetables. You want to avoid tomatoes normally. I'm not saying you have to forever or you actually have to. I'm an advocate of maybe use the elimination list for a little bit. And then if you've narrowed it down and figured out that this is your issue, then, just try and see what you can get away with. But, things like carrots that are high in antioxidants, but mainly it's the herbs, it's the green vegetables, some purple ones, anything purple colored is amazing. And as we know, for more than histamine issues. And just lots of whole foods, avoid processed foods, avoid emulsifiers, which have been shown to compromise the intestinal barrier. And histamine is involved in leaky gut. Histamine's job is to cause inflammation. Histamine is required to get the digestive process, and that's just a recipe for disaster for some people.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because histamine is not just this bad thing. It's obviously playing an important role in certain processes in our body. So how does one actually get this issue of histamine intolerance? Where is it originating, and why do some people have it, other people don't?
There's an indication that part of it is genetic. The DAO enzyme and HNMT mutations can be passed on from your parents. They can also be compromised. DAO can be compromised by different foods. I think it was dishwashing liquid, for example, but also a lack of nutrients such as copper, magnesium, B6, and a couple of others. If you don't have enough of these, you're not going to have enough DAO production in your body. So, magnesium in particular has been shown that if you are deficient in magnesium for just 4 days, histamine rises just incredibly.
Really?
I can't remember the actual figure, but magnesium is absolutely essential for people, as it is for so many different things. But I was surprised. I wasn't entirely surprised to find out, but it's kind of a biggie. And there's also modern living, processed foods, putting strain on our digestive system. The harder the digestive system has to work, the more histamine is going to be released, because it's, it gets the acid going, it breaks down the food, all that kind of stuff. So, and aside from that, we have the fact that, just generally our immune system is being overburdened and attacked by so many different things that it's constantly on high alert. So, I've always told people that the best I've ever felt was in Bali, not just because my stress was the lowest it's ever been, because, hey, it's Bali, but also because there was no chlorine in the water that I was bathing in. There was there was barely any pollution. There was no pesticides in my food. I was eating totally natural food straight from farm to table. It was amazing. There was no stress on my immune system. Mm-hmm. And of course, stress releases histamine and activates mast cells. So, the circle continues.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've also heard talk of mast cell disorder, and I've seen a book written on that. Do you have any familiarity with that concept, and how is that related to histamine intolerance? Is it the same thing, or are we talking about different things?
It depends who you ask.
Okay.
I was originally diagnosed with histamine intolerance on the basis of low DAO and high blood histamine. And I worked with that for a couple of years. And I'm actually grateful for that, because it taught me how to manage my symptoms through diet and lifestyle changes. But, something was never quite right. I talked to other people with histamine intolerance. I was going into anaphylactic shock. And I just thought, this doesn't really fit the profile of histamine intolerance. And that doesn't mean that everybody with mast cell activation has to go into anaphylactic shock. You have some people who are shockers and some people who are leakers. Leakers just have constant unpleasant symptoms like allergy-like symptoms, the itching, the nausea, all of that stuff. Mast cell activation is so closely linked because the mast cells release histamine along with other inflammation in the body. So that's one of the reasons that I pulled away from focusing on histamine so much, was because in my case, I realized that the mast cell was the more if you stop the mast cell from leaking the histamine and the rest of the inflammation into the body, you're already winning. Then you don't really need to watch what you eat so much because the mast cells aren't constantly pumping histamine into the bloodstream. I think that a lot of people diagnosed with histamine intolerance might have mast cell activation. I think a lot of people with mast cell activation technically have histamine intolerance. You can have low DAO, which is histamine intolerance, and you can also have mast cell activation, which means that you're just having too much of all of the inflammatory mediators. When you go in for a workup for mast cell activation, they do test you for histamine. It's one of the inflammatory agents that they do test for: histamine, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and interleukins, which are all housed in mast cells, segregated from the bloodstream until needed. But mast cell disorder, the mast cells are constantly splurging.
Interesting. So you mentioned something that around you moving away from histamine and towards mast cells. Can you just talk a little bit more in depth about why you made that move?
Simply because going low histamine didn't work for me. I was having terrible reactions, and I needed to figure out what was going on. And then I realized that for many people, even if you don't have a classic mast cell disorder, the constant triggering of histamine, mast cells are triggered by IgE reactions. So if you're reacting to pollen and the histamine type reaction is triggering the mast cells, then, even if you don't have a classic mast cell issue, you could be having a mast cell reaction. And that's what confounds a lot of doctors and patients also, because they go in with classic mast cell symptoms and they're told, well, I'm sorry, there's nothing happening. To further complicate the issue, mast cell activation and histamine intolerance are sometimes, or if not frequently, secondary to something else. So a virus, parasites, a medication that's not agreeing with you, high stress life, excess exercise. Exercising too hard can trigger your immune system. I think it's 72 days until the inflammation goes down from exercise. I can't remember exactly, but
72 hours.
Yeah. So, but for most healthy people, it's not really an issue because they don't have inflammation, So, or they do, but not very high levels. But if you think of the body as a bucket, a giant bucket, and you're operating here because, your mast cells are leaky or you're not enough DAO or whatever, and then you keep exercising at high intensity, you just keep spilling over and spilling over and spilling over. Whereas, if you were not dealing with this issue, you could exercise with no problem. But some people, who have problems with the inflammation from exercise, they do yoga, they lift weights at a lower intensity, they walk instead of run. I think exercise is a huge piece of the healing. And so I absolutely do not believe that people shouldn't exercise, even if it does make them spill over. I just think that they should find a way to exercise safely, but at a lower intensity, and then maybe work their way back up by fixing their diet, by addressing medication or parasites or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know there are a number of other conditions that histamine is linked with. Can you talk a bit about what those conditions are?
In one way or another, histamine either aggravates, mimics, or is a part of things like multiple sclerosis, cancer, chronic migraine, cluster migraines, that condition. It's involved in endometriosis. It can cause miscarriages by causing uterine contractions. It can also cause false positive egg. Well, you think you're ovulating, but you're not, because an immature egg has been released. But that's just in animal studies. I haven't seen anything in human studies. It's been linked to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. It's a neurotransmitter. Generalized anxiety disorder was the latest one I saw. I mean, inflammation in general has been linked to a multitude of psychiatric disorders now. And I think it was researchers at King's College in London are developing an inflammatory cytokine test, and that's what you call what's in mast cells, to diagnose people with different kinds of depression, to see who needs medication.
Interesting. Are there any conditions which are like huge red flags for histamine issues specifically?
Meaning if you have that condition, you should look at histamine, or?
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, cancer generally, just inflammation. And, it's difficult because I have readers who have multiple sclerosis who have found that it is beneficial for them to change their diet. But you have people like Dr. Terry Walls, who discovered that a long time ago, but who doesn't focus on histamine specifically.
Yeah.
I would just say if you're suffering from any arthritis, any kind of inflammatory condition, you would benefit not just from adjusting your histamine intake, but by adjusting your diet so that it's anti-inflammatory overall.
Yeah. And I know we talked a bit about that, but can you talk like a bit more in depth on the overall picture of what an antihistamine diet looks like, or an antihistamine lifestyle, I should say, because I would imagine there are certain things that are also helpful beyond nutrition.
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I would advise people to do is to look at their bath and beauty products, because there are so many triggers in there that the immune system is just bombarded with so much garbage. It's just unbelievable that we know triggers mast cells in the immune system. So, or if you're doing the diet and you're not feeling better, definitely look at those things like perfumes. So it's kind of take a look around, see what you're doing that can be more organic, and beyond that, diet wise, it's really just there's many different interpretations of this. Mine is primarily plant-based because I've never been really a fan of animal protein. That's more just, worrying about the animals for most of my life. But, when push has come to shove and I have not been able to fix things through pills, supplements, I have increased my intake. But so it's primarily plant-based, very low in grains or no grains at all, ideally. I'll include a little bit of black rice, a little bit of gluten-free oats. Breakfast is, it's really individual. Some people can tolerate eggs, some people can't, but generally it's low protein, which is in line with Dr. Walter Longo's research. He's the fasting mimicking diet researcher at USC.
Mm-hmm.
And I follow his work very closely, and I've been doing his fasting for a long time now. And, showing that the optimum amount of protein is actually quite low for people who have inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of leafy greens, lots of antihistamine foods. There's plenty of lists on the internet. Take them with a massive grain of salt.
Why?
Because you'll find things like pineapple on there. Pineapple, tomatoes. Yes, if you don't have a histamine problem, those can be anti-inflammatory. But if you do, yikes. So
wait, they're foods that you'll see on as anti-inflammatory foods, or foods that are high in histamine?
Oh, no, I'll have food saying, I've seen lists on the internet saying if you have allergies or if you react to pollen, eat pineapple. Most people who come to me with issues, I tell them, okay, the first thing is, just cut out pineapple, nuts, dairy, and wheat and soy and yeast and see how you feel. Most of them go away and they don't have a problem anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But they look online for these lists, and a lot of it, I've seen one list saying soy for your allergies. Soy is one of the most allergenic foods on the planet.
Interesting. Why do you think there's such a disconnect there?
Because I think people are writing blog posts to generate traffic and not necessarily taking very much care.
Good answer.
Okay. What the Livestrong website is all about.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of spammy, health blogs out there that are just, they decide to write an article on something for SEO purposes after doing 8 minutes of research on the topic.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. So, what are some of the most histamine rich foods that are, so I actually, you mentioned a list there. We should go back to that because it was dairy, nuts, yeast, which I assume is mainly bread that we're talking about.
Soy.
Okay. Soy. What else?
For many people, it's corn, which is unfortunate because a lot of vitamin C's are made from ascorbic acid, which is often derived from fermented corn. fermented foods are problematic for people with histamine issues, which a lot of people come to realize they have a histamine problem because they try the GAPS diet. All the fermented foods make them crazy. I personally almost had a nervous breakdown from fermented foods.
Wow.
I literally thought I was losing my mind. I was shaking. I was manic. I couldn't catch my breath. And then I just realized, wow, I've been eating a lot of fermented foods. And I just stopped for a while and it all went away. The others would be, wheat is just so inflammatory. It causes so many issues for people. The research that's coming out now, you don't have to be celiac. You don't even have to be gluten intolerant. There's other wheat proteins that trigger systemic inflammation in susceptible individuals, regardless of the other issues.
Yeah.
The biggies, cheese, because it's fermented and it's dairy. Dairy is, inflammatory. Those are the biggies. When people tell me, oh, I don't eat tomatoes, but, I'll have a chunk of cheese. And I'm like, reverse that. Because the tomato has so many more nutrients. It is anti-inflammatory overall. It contains some quercetin, whereas cheese, it's fermented, plus it's dairy. Generally, I tell people, if you find food on more than one list, be wary of it.
More than one histamine-rich list?
No. Meaning just, for example, spinach is on the high histamine list and it's on the high oxalic acid list.
Oh, I see.
So if you're dealing with inflammation, it might not be the best choice, especially if you're suffering from symptoms relating to oxalic acid, such as bladder issues, dizziness, stuff like that. For example, some of the nuts, almonds are low histamine. Well, I've just contradicted myself there because almonds are low histamine, but they're high oxalate. So it depends what your issue is. But generally, I stay away from the foods or eat them in moderation because I eat pretty much anything nowadays that isn't processed that I like. I don't like dairy, so that was never an issue for me.
Gotcha. So I want to talk about one condition particularly. I'm curious if you know much about the link between histamine and migraines.
Yes. Histamine in particular has been linked to a lack of diamine oxidase, the histamine degrading enzyme, but histamine independently of that has been shown to, if you have inflammation in your brain, it's gonna make you more prone to migraines, or it's going to make your migraines more intense. And that's what researchers have found, that histamine can make migraines more intense and that they can make them last longer. It can make them last longer.
Have you found success in the people you've worked with who have suffered from migraines by adopting your approach?
Yeah, it depends because you have, yes, some have, myself included. In the past, I realized that if I took an antihistamine, as soon as I felt a migraine coming on, it would stop.
Interesting.
But that doesn't mean it was a classic migraine. There are different mechanisms by which a migraine can occur. But I had a 6-month migraine once.
Oof,
Nothing. They offered me morphine in the end, and I refused, thankfully, because that is a big histamine trigger. But yes, a lot of people have resolved their migraines. Some people have had tyramine issues, which also triggers migraines. So then you're looking at 2 food lists. So I used to do consults. I don't do them anymore. There's workshops and there's Facebook groups for people to get involved in, but it's sometimes a combination of things and seeing what works. But histamine will make anything worse. That I tell people, think of the body as a giant inflammation bucket, and within the big bucket are contained little buckets. So you have the salicylic acid bucket, the oxalic acid, histamine, fructose, you name it, okay, and a little stress bucket. And one of these buckets fills up and spills over, the big bucket spills over, and you get a reaction. And that's what confuses a lot of people, because they think, well, I haven't eaten a lot of histamine today. And I say, well, have you had a ton of salicylic acid? Have you had a ton of oxalic acid? Look at your diet. Are you mono eating? Are you not mixing your foods up enough? I tell people to imagine like their plate cut into portions. Have a little bit of high histamine, a little bit of low histamine, a little bit of salicylic acid. Don't have one giant plate of anything.
And so what does that look like as a practical example of the plate that you're painting a picture of using specific foods?
Okay, so for me, for example, a salad would be a big mixed bag of mesclun greens, that are not high in oxalic acid. Some arugula on top, which is, low antihistamine, low oxalic acid, high in vitamin K and in quercetin and antioxidants. A couple of slices of avocado, which is very high histamine for a fruit, sorry. And I will put a little bit so I'll make a dressing from cilantro and basil and thyme, for example. Each one of those is antihistamine. And I'll mix it with olive oil, which has been shown to boost the DAO in the gut. And then, I might toss some seeds on them, which are high in oxalic acid, and I'll kind of make whenever I put a high histamine food, I counterbalance it with, a dressing, or, the way I cook it. The way you cook food can make it more allergenic. There's a study that shows that peanuts become 30% more allergenic when they're roasted.
Interesting. As opposed to raw.
Exactly.
Okay. And does that apply across the board, that generally cooked food is more allergenic?
Depends how you cook it.
Okay. Tell me more.
Histamine foods, acrylamides, ACEs and ACHs, I want to say, they form when you roast the food too much, and that creates an oxidating effect on the body, and that interacts with histamine. Mm-hmm. So, either you want to counterbalance that. I saw something interesting on Dr. Michael Grieger's website,
nutritionfacts.org.
Exactly. Love his website. And he was saying that you should eat a handful of antioxidants containing foods with every meal, so that you counterbalance the oxidizing effect of whatever else you're eating. Dr. Herman has also been saying that for years. And I started doing that a while back, and yeah, it makes a big difference.
Nice. Awesome. So, wow, that's quite a mix that you have there of all these. It's a lot of different plant foods. And so some are rich in oxalic acid. So you talked about putting certain foods in there that are maybe salicylic acid rich or oxalic acid rich. And yet, part of the paradigm that you're presenting is like that these are buckets which you can potentially have too much of. So how do we balance that, of kind of?
It's really individual.
Okay.
It's really hard. I mean, people think, it might be a cop-out for me to say that, but it really is highly individual. And that's one of the reasons that my readers like what I do, because I don't dictate. Mm-hmm. Tell them, your body will tell you what the right balance is. We're constantly walking a tightrope, and one day something works, one day something doesn't work. And we think, oh, better pull back. I had a bit too much histamine yesterday, so I'm going to eat a bit more of this or that, and your brain just turns into this computer of you work it out and it becomes second. I don't refer to lists anymore. I don't consciously balance my foods. It just becomes something ingrained. And when you're cheating, you're happy about it and you're doing it.
Yeah. Gotcha. So if one suspects that they have a histamine issue, or if one is diagnosed with it, can you lay out like how this should be treated kind of in a step-by-step way?
I mean, ideally you want diagnosis first. So you're either looking for the naturopath or you're looking for an allergist and an immunologist. Failing that, you could try the elimination diet on your own, which involves finding a list on the internet. And there are many. There is no definitive list. I wish I could create one for people, but there's too many variables. Mm-hmm. I looked into getting each food tested, and it just, all of the labs told me, vegetables, there's just barely any histamine in there. Our machines won't even pick that up. Forget it. So I have been trying, but, and even if I worked out a definitive list, it wouldn't matter because it's also individual. It depends what you ate that day. The WHO recently released a report saying that the histamine levels in fish might be too high for people who have allergies and who have immune system problems, or who drink alcohol when they eat the fish, because alcohol paralyzes the DAO enzyme that degrades the histamine. So that's an example of what I tell people. Be careful, be mindful of what you're pairing your foods with. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Are there any other examples like that?
No, that's the biggie. I mean, it would just be, you know, just be aware of what category your food falls into. Make sure the food is fresh because bacteria triggers histamine release.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't want any kind of spoiled food. You know, fish should be as fresh as possible or flash frozen at sea.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so find yourself a list, try the elimination diet for a couple of weeks, and then bring the foods back and see what causes a reaction, what doesn't. What I tell people to do is make yourself a spreadsheet with your major symptoms across the top. And then every time you have a symptom, don't do a food diary every day. Just every time you have a symptom that falls under one of these, write down what you remember of what you ate that day. And if you can, what you remember of the day before. Mm-hmm. That way you start to see patterns, and it's irrelevant what list the foods fall on because you know what your exact triggers are. Mm-hmm. And before you do that, if you create a list of foods that you would like to integrate into your diet, because a lot of people end up eliminating way too much. So I made myself a list of super high nutrient foods that I desperately wanted back into my diet. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one by one, I'd bring those over into my diet and see how.
Yeah, I love that.
You know, there's also research showing that low level exposure to antigens will stop affecting mast cells at some point.
Okay. So translate that into practical terms for people. So eat a very, very small amount of a food that you would normally react to.
I can't give that advice because I'm not a nutritionist and I'm not a doctor and I don't want anybody to get hurt, but that's what I.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some research on that I've seen recently. We're talking about introducing very just minute amounts of foods that you would normally have a reaction to as a way to kind of desensitize your body to it.
Yeah, it's very difficult. You know, one of the ways that I did it originally was I would cook the food in a tiny bit, well, not a tiny bit, but in some olive oil and keep it in there very briefly, then take the food out and then cook the rest of my food in that olive oil. Mm-hmm. So that my brain and my immune system were not actually consciously aware of the food. Yeah. Especially if it had bothered me a lot in the past. So it was a very gentle introduction. And each time I would leave the piece of food in there longer. Ah,
very nice. That's a cool way. Cool. So, well, this has been great. So are there any final kind of words of advice that you could offer to people who are interested in learning more about this subject and who want to take things to the next level and start to address some of their histamine issues?
I would say don't be an extremist. Don't fall into the rabbit hole. Manage your stress and learn to meditate if you're not already. That is the most important thing. I tell people if you're stressed out, you're not going to be able to add foods back to your diet. It's just not going to happen. Your brain becomes wired to reactions. It becomes wired to, oh, I had cucumber before. Oh, well, a zucchini looks like a cucumber. And I was violently ill the last time I had something that was green and oblong. Oh, well, I'm going to react to zucchini too.
Right. You know, I think so many people get in that down the rabbit hole of elimination diets end up cultivating so much fear of certain foods in their mind that the fear of the food almost becomes worse than the food itself.
Absolutely. I was orthorexic for a number of years, a type of anorexia. Mm-hmm. I became fearful of food. I demonized it. I had a love-hate relationship with it. And, you know, I had many a nervous breakdown at the supermarket.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Yasmina. It's been an absolute pleasure. And where can people find more about your work if they want to learn more about what you do and the information that you've put out there?
So the new website that I've just launched is healing, healinghistamine.com. And you'll find information for your doctor, you'll find food lists, you'll find online workshops that you can do at any time, and there's ebooks and there's free information all over the blog. I poured my heart into that website.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Yasmina. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's been a pleasure. This has been the most in-depth and useful interview I've done.
Oh, thank you. Well, glad to hear that. Thank you again. Bye. Bye.
Hey there, this is Ari Whitten with the Energy Blueprint. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I assume you did, otherwise you probably wouldn't have stuck around this long. So in that case, I want to make sure that you go over to theenergyblueprint.com and enter your name and email address so that you're on our email list and you get all the latest and greatest information as we release it. Theenergyblueprint.com is the #1 source for information on the science of overcoming fatigue and enhancing your energy levels. So make sure you head on over to theenergyblueprint.com, enter your name and email address, or just your email address, and sign up for our email newsletter where you'll get all the latest information, all the latest podcasts, all the latest articles and videos as we release them on the subject of increasing your energy levels. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.